Good evening, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. You should see popping up on your screen here just a quick little pre-event survey. This helps us kind of just gauge education and how well we're doing. It also allows us to put on more events later in the future, especially if people like certain events, we know which ones we could do more of, if that kind of makes sense. My name is Olivia, and I'm an AmeriCorps member with Conservation Nebraska's Common Ground program. This program aims to improve stewardship of Nebraska's natural resources by increasing knowledge and concern for the most important conservation issues facing our state. To make this happen, our focus is on providing volunteer opportunities, engaging community members, and continually improving local conservation practices, and providing educational opportunities like this webinar. Tonight we have with us Mel Nenneman. He's a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and has worked at Valentine National Refuge since 2002. He is interested in all types of prairie wildlife and is still trying to figure out what makes the grassland ecosystem tick. We also have John McClinton from Pheasants Forever. John was born and raised in rural southwestern Pennsylvania in the foothills of the Allegheny Mountains. John attributes his rural upbringing and time outdoors as the driving force towards his career in the wildlife field. He has a Bachelor of Science degree in Fisheries and Wildlife Biology from California University of Pennsylvania. Prior to working with Pheasants Forever, John held several positions in the wildlife field, first as a waterfowl technician with Ducks Unlimited in North Dakota, then as a wildlife camera technician with the U.S. Geological Survey, installing cameras on nests of endangered and threatened shorebirds. He then went on to work with UC Davis, collecting lek behavior data on greater sage grouse in central Wyoming. John came to Pheasants Forever in the summer of 2019 and covers the counties of Lancaster, Cass, Saline, and Seward. Let me end this poll really quick so we can get that out of everyone's way. Before I hand it over to John and Melvin, again, I just want to remind all participants that mics are muted and we cannot see you. But we have a few poll questions, like I mentioned at the beginning and towards the end. We will have a designated Q&A time, so the chat function will remain open. So feel free to drop any questions you have along the way in there and we will get to them. Originally, we were going to have another speaker with us tonight, Dr. Larkin Powell. He was unable to be here with us, but he did provide us with a pretty neat little intro video that we're going to play here really quick, and then Mel will get started. So give me 1 second, I'll get that up with us. And if for some reason you can't hear the audio, let me know in the chat and I'll see if I can get it fixed.
Winter is slowly losing its grip on the plains, and wildlife are starting to plan for spring. Driving gravel roads, you can hear evidence that male greater prairie chickens are starting to gather at group lek sites. On the lek sites, or group mating grounds, the males raise their penny feathers above their head, exposing the bright air sacs on their necks. Their main vocalization is known as booming. When a group of males vocalize at the same time, their voices form a chorus. And that sound travels beyond the lek site to the surrounding space, sometimes as far as 2 kilometers. In a paper published in Ethology in August 2019, our research team evaluated whether the noise from a wind energy facility reduces distance at which the male chorus can be heard away from a lek site. The answer is yes. As with any source of noise that raises the ambient sound in a communication setting, wind turbine noise has the potential to mask sound from prairie chicken leks. The sound remaining above the surrounding noise is called the signal-to-noise ratio, and that sound level declines as the distance from the lek increases. The sound level of the chorus is reduced further at any distance away from the lek when a wind turbine is nearby. Although not as drastic, it's similar to when you try to hold a conversation in a quiet forest compared to on a busy street in a construction zone. But our paper also explores another important angle on the male boom chorus of prairie chickens. Since early biologists first studied prairie chickens, scientists have generally assumed that since we hear sound away from the lek, that sound must have some reason for existing at such long distances. It has long been assumed that male prairie chickens create sounds at leks to show females where the lek site is located and then attract them to the lek for mating. But when we observe behavior on leks, we see a lot of activity between males. The fighting can be vicious at times. Perhaps the sound that carries beyond the lek is just a byproduct of a group of very aggressive males who want to mate. We realized our data allowed us to test these hypotheses. First, if the level of the chorus remained constant, no matter how many females visited the lek, that would suggest that males continued to advertise for more females. Alternatively, if the level of the chorus rose with more females at the lek, that would indicate sound levels were the result of male-male competition. And sure enough, our data showed that the male chorus level rose significantly as more females visited the leks, supporting the male-male competition hypothesis. We also tested the two hypotheses by assessing trends in the level of male chorus during the breeding season. The long-distance advertising hypothesis might predict that male chorus levels would be strongest early in the season and die down as more females became familiar with the lek site. However, our data only showed a small decline during the season. Male chorus levels were high even before females were present in the landscape around the leks, and they remained high for a large part of the breeding season. The small decline provided weak support for the long-distance advertising hypothesis. So in the end, data from greater prairie chickens in Nebraska suggests the sounds we hear in the spring as we pass the prairie chicken lek are not for us or for female prairie chickens to hear. More evidence suggests that these sounds are just the wonderful sounds of male prairie chickens doing what they do best, fighting for the best spot on the lek to gain more matings when the females arrive. Prairie chickens will always have more to share with us, but for now, our work will help conservation planners evaluate the risk of building wind energy facilities near prairie chicken lek sites. Thanks for taking time to learn about our work. We invite you to Nebraska to see the prairie chickens next spring.
All right, that was really neat. I'm glad Larkin could give us that option to show that video. If for some reason the audio or video wasn't working, we will have a recording and we will send a follow-up link with that video in it if you were really interested in seeing what was in it. Now I will hand it over to Mel and we will get started.
Okay. Hopefully that shared screen worked. Okay, so as Olivia said, my name is Mel Nenneman, and I was asked to do a presentation this evening on the prairie grouse that live here in the state of Nebraska. So I was kind of asked to cover the ecology and some of the management, so we'll see how I do. So first off, I thought I'd just say that grouse fall into a group of birds that are called Galliformes. And the members of that group include quail and partridge, grouse, pheasants, turkeys, and of course, our domestic chickens. All of these birds are characterized by having kind of stocky, stout bodies, long legs, strong feet. They're mostly terrestrial. They spend a lot of their time walking around on the ground. Their flights tend to be short, powerful flights that don't take them very far. All of these birds nest on the ground, and they have precocial young, which means that the young are born feathered and they can leave the nest shortly after they hatch, and they forage for their own food. And then all these birds have a digestive system that has a crop, which is an enlarged area in their esophagus that allows them to eat a lot of food in a short period of time so they can go find a safer place to digest their food. And then they also have a gizzard, which is the muscular organ in their digestive system that basically takes the place of their teeth, which they don't have, and grinds up their food. So the two species of grouse we have here in Nebraska are the greater prairie chicken, which was introduced in Larkin's video, and the Sharktail grouse down here in the lower right corner. To identify a greater prairie chicken, they're a chicken-sized bird. They're kind of a rich chocolate brown barring on their feathers. Their tail is sort of short and rounded, very dark. And the males have these bright orange air sacs that they puff up when they display to make the booming sound that you hear when you visit the lek sites, which are their breeding grounds. And then the male chickens also have these pinnae feathers that they erect when they're displaying. So it looks like they have big rabbit ears sticking up. Sharktails, on the other hand, are about the same size. Both these birds weigh about 2 pounds. Sharktails are much lighter in color, sort of almost a gray or golden brown. And then their chest is white, and they have these kind of chevron or arrow-shaped pattern all across their breast. And their central tail feathers are longest in the middle, giving them their namesake sharp tail. And then the male sharktail has a kind of light purple colored ear sac that they inflate when they're displaying. Both of these displays are very fun to watch. If you get a chance to do it in the spring, I highly recommend it. So I just wanted to show you a range map of these two species. The greater prairie chicken shown here on the left. The light blue color is the historic range of the greater prairie chicken. And then the darker blue is their current range. And you can see here in Nebraska, the greater prairie chicken covers a pretty good chunk of the state. They're kind of absent in some of the bigger, heavily used agricultural areas. And then out here in the western part of the state, when you get into the shortgrass prairie, they kind of peter out. I did want to point out here that the prairie chicken has 3 subspecies. One is an extinct species, and that was the heath hen that lived out here on the East Coast. And then also the Atwater's prairie chicken, which lives down here in the coastal plain of Louisiana and Texas. And they're an endangered species. So the 2 subspecies that are associated with the greater prairie chicken, well, one's no longer with us. And so the greater prairie chickens are doing fairly well, with the exception of some of the small populations in Illinois, Missouri, Iowa, and Wisconsin. They're really struggling to save those populations. Then moving on to the Sharktail Grouse here on the right. The dark blue is where they live most of the time. And then this lighter blue is just kind of rarely occupied parts of the range. And what you can see here in Nebraska, Sharktail grouse occupy about the northern half or so of Nebraska. And the populations up here in the sand hills are really quite good. But then they kind of peter out as you move south. So kind of a little brief bit of history of the two species. Prairie chickens and Sharktail grouse both experienced a bit of a population increase as European settlers started moving west across the United States. It's thought that when the bison were killed out on the prairies and European settlers pretty much indiscriminately killed any varmint that they saw. So wolves and coyotes and all the predators basically took a beating during that time. And then as European settlers moved in, they had small fields that they planted. So there was some corn and some crops available for winter foods that really allowed the prairie chickens to do well during that time period. But moving into the 20th century, market hunters started to show up, and they killed hundreds and hundreds of birds and sent them to markets in the eastern states. And then as populations dropped due to market hunting, states began to implement game regulations, and that helped. But then this thing called industrial agriculture came along, and that really reduced the amount of habitat available for these birds. And it's caused a lot of the struggles that are being seen in states like Illinois and Iowa, where there's very little native prairie left and very little grassland. So what do these two species of prairie grouse need? I think probably the biggest, most important thing is large grassland landscapes. These are the places where these birds are going to thrive. This is a photo from Valentine National Wildlife Refuge where I work. You can see there's not much in the way of trees in the landscape, and lots of big open sky. So kind of drilling down on that, outside of just grasslands, these prairie grouse need several different types of grassland throughout the course of the season. Starting out in the upper left-hand corner here, for their lek sites, both prairie chickens and Sharktail grouse choose sites that have relatively short vegetation, a good vista so that the males can see predators trying to sneak up on them. The males are pretty vulnerable at this time. When they're actively displaying, they're distracted by hens and fighting with other males. So they like to be in pretty open areas so that they can see potential predators coming. And then as you move into the nesting season over here on the right, the hens select areas that have taller cover to nest in. In biologist speak, we would say taller, denser cover. So grasses and plants that are thicker. And it's long been thought that nest sites are selected for protection from predators, hiding cover. But some recent research has suggested that the thermal protection provided by that vegetation may be just as important. The study found that the temperatures at the nest site were much cooler than the surrounding landscape. So apparently the hens were selecting areas that provided some protection from the heat as well. And then once the chicks hatch, we have these kind of fluffy little guys, they need cover that is tall enough that they can escape from predators, duck and hide, so to speak. But they also need to be open enough that they can run around on those little legs and forage for the insects that provide a big part of their diet. And then during the fall and winter, the birds use a combination of all three of these types of grassland. They'll use some of the short areas for foraging. They'll tuck into the taller cover to roost during the day. And again, where the chicks like to forage is also a pretty good habitat for adults to forage in. So that's kind of what a grouse is looking for in terms of vegetation structure in the landscape. And I thought I'd throw this in just to provide a little bit of information on what they like to eat. Adults are largely vegetarian. They eat things like the clover leaves up here on the upper left. As you move through the season and the chicks hatch, they focus on eating a lot of invertebrates, grasshopper nymphs, butterfly larvae, caterpillars. These invertebrates are high in protein, which is really important for the growth of those chicks. And up to 90% of a chick's diet will be comprised of invertebrates. Adults do eat some insects. One study I looked at suggested about 10 to 15% of the adult diet during the summer would be made up of insects. Then kind of moving through into late summer and fall, the grouse will switch to eating more fruits and seeds. One of the most important food items up in this part of the country is the rose hip. So this little plant here is called Prairie Rose, and the fruit that it produces is this kind of bright red berry looking thing, or crab apple, if you will. It's actually called a rose hip, and grouse really focus on these, particularly early in the fall. And this one I thought would be fun for people if you recognize this plant. This is leaves of three, leave it be, poison ivy. And poison ivy produces these little white berries, which grouse are fond of eating. And then moving into the winter months, if we get a bunch of snow on the ground, sharptails in particular will often go up and sit in the cedar trees and eat cedar berries. Prairie chickens are more tied to waste grain. So a lot of times the prairie chickens will actually move off of the refuge here and go off to some nearby corn pivots to spend the winter. And then finally, kind of moving into the late winter and spring, kind of where we're at now, the buds of willows and cottonwood trees become a pretty important food source. Finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about habitat management and conservation. So diverse grasslands are pretty important for most species of wildlife. If you have a high diversity of grasses, high diversity of flowering plants, you're going to have more potential food items available. The more flowering plants you have, the more butterflies, different species of butterflies you would support, the more species of grasshoppers you would have. And so these prairies evolved with fire as one of the things that help create the biodiversity that we see, and then also grazing. Of course, historically, it would have been bison, but now we use domestic cattle as a grazing animal. And this picture in the upper center is a place where we had a burn go through, and this picture was taken about a month later. You can see the edge of the burn right here and some of the vegetation that didn't burn, and then this bright green new growth coming up in the burn. So we use a combination of prescribed burning and grazing on Valentine Refuge to help manage the grasslands for grouse and the other species of wildlife native to these prairies. Obviously, when you burn something, it's going to be short cover for a while. So if you do a burn early in the spring, you might create some decent lekking habitat. Obviously, you want to leave some unburned so that there's places to go nest. And then as this grassland grows back, it starts to provide good brood rearing habitat because the chicks can kind of come out on the edge of the burn and then duck back into the unburned for cover. You can do similar things with grazing. And my next slide here shows an example of that. And in the upper left, you can see we did some grazing during the winter. And as you can see by the cow pies and stuff here, this is pretty open cover right now. And so potentially a good place for a lek. And then this is the same spot. If you look at this willow tree kind of in the center, here's that same willow. This is after the growing season and no grazing during that time. And you can see we've got some really tall grass cover available. And then this is the same area the following spring, and you can see the snow has laid some of the grass down, but we still got some nice tall cover for nesting. And with the areas that are laid down, it opens up some areas for the chicks to be able to run around. So that's kind of just a brief example of some of the things that grouse would look for. And with that, I've reached the end of my presentation, and I'll turn it over to John, and I'll be happy to try and answer questions at the end.
Let me go ahead and share my screen here. Is anybody seeing that?
Yep.
Great, great. Well, thanks, Melvin, and thanks, Olivia, for having me. My name's John McClinton. As you heard in the opening, I'm a farm bill wildlife biologist with Pheasants Forever. I've been on the job here in Nebraska for about 3 years. And after that discussion about prairie grouse ecology, I guess I'll kind of back clean up here and talk a little bit about some cost share opportunities and some ways to get some habitat management on the ground. Well, there we go. But first, I thought I'd talk a little bit about who is Pheasants Forever. If you're not familiar with the habitat organization, Pheasants Forever was formed in 1982 when a group of pheasant hunters in Minnesota noticed that a connection between upland habitat loss and declining pheasant populations. They formed the first chapter there in 1982, and it's kind of grown across the across the country since then. And today, Pheasants Forever holds the reputation as the habitat organization. Pheasants Forever's mission statement is to conserve pheasants, quail, and other wildlife through habitat improvements, public access, education, and conservation advocacy. And our vision is that current and future generations of hunters and conservationists are able to enjoy abundant populations of wild pheasants, quail, and other wildlife. In 2005, after a while of Pheasants Forever kind of realizing that quail were in a lot of trouble as well, in pretty steep decline, and much of the bobwhite quail range across the country did not fall within the primary range of ringneck pheasants, and therefore did not have Pheasants Forever chapters. Pheasants Forever went ahead and also formed Quail Forever. And Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever has kind of a unique model among the various conservation organizations. Only the $35 a year membership fee goes to the national headquarters. And the national headquarters uses those funds to put out there's a award-winning magazine that comes a handful of times a year. Professional services of biologists such as myself, and then some various other staff and conservation education and legislative advocacy programs. And as you can see over here on the left, 91 cents on the dollar goes towards habitat projects, public awareness, and education. And local chapters of Pheasants Forever retain 100% of their locally raised funds. So what does Pheasants Forever do on the ground here? Well, nationwide, Pheasants Forever since 1982 and Quail Forever have attributed habitat work on over 20 million acres. And, that's great in and of itself, but you might be thinking, that's great, but what about Nebraska? Well, just recently, we've reached our 7th million acre that Pheasants Forever has had a hand in some type of habitat work on these acres. It's not all bright and cheery, though. There are some definite conservation challenges here in Nebraska, though this might be a little bit of overlap with some of the things that Melvin mentioned earlier. But as you can see, 2.9 billion birds have disappeared since 1970, and the hardest hit of those bird species has been the suite of grassland birds, where 53% has declined since 1970, or 720 million grassland birds in total, in estimation there. And to put that in kind of a little bit of a better way to understand it, that's 3 in 4 of eastern meadowlarks have disappeared. Other species that have had pretty steep declines of the grassland bird suite there, 65% decline in bobolinks, 89% of meadowlarks, and then 72% in grasshopper sparrows. So what do all these species have in common, particularly in common with other species like quail and pheasants and prairie chickens that we're talking about tonight? Well, they're all ground nesters. They're insectivorous for at least a portion of their lifespan, and they're grassland dependent. So what are some threats to these birds? Well, habitat loss for one, as Melvin mentioned, about prairie loss there. Historically, the tallgrass prairie ecosystem occupied 150 million acres. It's 230 million thousand square miles. Through conversion or other uses, only 1 to 3% remain of that virgin native prairie. 2% of the historic range here in Nebraska, and those mostly exist in small tracts of 80 acres or less. And when you consider what we learned earlier about these birds needing large expanses of grasslands, that's a real issue. Another issue, haying during the nesting season. Here in Nebraska, we kind of consider our nesting season to be approximately that May 1st to July 15th date, though so there's some new research coming out that's extending even into August. But if you need to hay, if you're haying during that period of time, if you could use equipment like flushing bars or some type of wildlife friendly mowing pattern, i.e. mowing from the inside out to allow animals to escape, that would be desired, I suppose. And if possible, if you can delay mowing until that mid-July point, you could give nesting birds a fighting chance there. Loss of insect diversity. Grassland songbirds and game birds such as pheasants, quail, and grouse all require insects for at least a portion of their life cycle. Game bird chicks require soft-bodied insects in order to quickly increase fat reserves and establish feathers after they're born or after they hatch. Why is that important? That's important because these chicks, if you picture a chick, pick the species there, quail, pheasants, prairie chickens, it doesn't really matter. The size of the end of my thumb or the end of your thumb, they can't thermoregulate yet, so they're trying to stay warm, right? So the faster they can put these fat reserves on, and they can put feathers on to stay warm and get up off the ground away from predators. That's why this is important. And then another issue we're facing here in Nebraska is eastern red cedar encroachment. Anytime we're talking about grassland birds, prairie chickens in particular, some of the research I've seen has suggested avoidance of prairie chickens by tree densities as low as 1 to 2 trees per acre. You can see in these photos here we're well past that. So going from the photo on the left to the photo on the right, we can see a natural kind of progression over time. But what we also see is kind of an ecosystem here at the tipping point. And I would advance that on for some time. And how long is it until we get to this? And then I would ask, is this still a grassland? And I think the answer is no. If you're a grassland dependent species, you've given up on this a long time ago. Particularly prairie chickens have given up on this quite a while ago. And if you're a producer grazing cattle or something like that, you might be able to graze cattle or something like that on the first two photos that in the last slide, but you're far from grazing cattle here. But eastern red cedar costs more than just wildlife. It uses a lot of water. An acre of cedar uses approximately 40 gallons of water a day. You can see here from this graphic here from Oklahoma State University School of Natural Resources. Eastern red cedar woodlands with mechanical clearing and converted back to native prairie increased soil water storage 1.6 times and increased runoff, which feeds ponds and streams, by 4.5 times. And in today's our current situations here in Nebraska with our weather situation here in Nebraska, I'd ask, could your operation use more water? And I would think the answer there is probably yes. It's not just water and not just wildlife there. Public school funding is on the decline. 2006 to 2016, we lost $2.4 million on eastern red cedar control from public school funding. The annual expenditures have increased by $250,000 since 2006. School Land Trust's entire revenue from grazing leases goes directly to the Nebraska public schools. So that's definitely money that our public school system doesn't have here in Nebraska, based on eastern red cedar encroachment. Livestock production: 50% of the U.S. beef is raised in the Great Plains. It's a $79 billion industry. Some research from Sam Fullendorf and Jacques Twidwell found that On sites where grasslands have been converted to woodlands, livestock production has decreased by 75%. And I think the Direct Twidwell's lab at UNL does a really good job of putting it into perspective here. Annually, Nebraska loses enough forage production to stretch round bales from St. Louis to Denver. That's 850 miles, or approximately 876,000 round bales. This is a slide that relates to pheasants, but I think you could extrapolate it to prairie chickens or sharptails as well. CRP enrollment increases pheasant abundance. However, the benefits of CRP are inhibited by trees. You can see, the increase in trees negatively affects grassland bird abundance here. This is a growing problem. You can see with this heat map here on the left-hand side. It is if you're not familiar with this type of map, it's essentially our warmer colors have a lower fire interval return. So those areas burn more frequently, and then the cooler colors burned less frequently. So you can see here in Nebraska, we're burning on an average of about 4 to 6 years or so. And over here on the right, you can see that, prior to the year 2000 or so, this eastern red cedar, this woody encroachment issue was really a southern Great Plains issue, or really a Texas and Oklahoma issue, but it's kind of skyrocketed and expanded since then. I've heard a lot of people refer to it as the Green Glacier. But there is hope. Cedars are easily controlled with prescribed fire when smaller than 6 feet. Cedars can be controlled effectively with appropriate fuel loads when under 15 feet, if you've got the grass height and like I said, the fuel loads for it. If they're over about that 15 feet mark, you best consider mechanical removal. And once they're initially controlled, continuing management with fire or other methods on a rotational basis will help keep those cedars at bay. And here I have most Nebraska historically burned on a 3 to 5 year rotation. I think I just said 4 to 6, but at least we're in the same ballpark there. So that there's help for dealing with this these cedar issues or other type of wood encroachments or just grassland revitalization. Melvin had a handful of photos there relating to prescribed fire. Pheasants Forever has 11 different prescribed fire associations, prescribed burn associations, and a handful of other ones that are kind of loosely, little less affiliated with Pheasants Forever, but still do great work. These are groups of landowners helping landowners essentially get together and burn their acreages or burn their properties. You can see on the left here, there's a mobile prescribed burn unit. This is a trailer from Pheasants Forever that has 2 pumper units and drip torches and all the equipment that you could need to conduct a prescribed fire. We lease these or rent these trailers out to the Prescribed Burn Association. So if you see one of these trailers going down the road, give us a wave. It's going to do good things. Habitat can boost on-farm productivity. You see, this is a program what we call Prairie Strips. It's available in the CRP program. It's a CP43 practice. You can see it can control things such as runoff and sediment loss, phosphorus and nitrogen, as well as increasing bird abundance and pollinator abundance. And higher yields and more abundant wildlife can be had with diverse habitat as well. A recent study published in Nature Food found a 12% higher corn yield and 15% higher wheat yields than national average when incorporating diverse habitat. Landscapes that added diversity typically yielded 17 to 18% more bushels per acre. We got more beneficial insects doing the pollinating of our crop fields. We've got areas for wildlife. It's a win-win situation. So how can Pheasants Forever help? first, one thing we can, how can habitat help here in Nebraska? One thing that can be done is the use of the Conservation Reserve Program. This is a program from the Farm Service Agency within the USDA. It's a nationwide voluntary conservation program providing a annual payment for taking lands out of production or for not farming these particular acres. And typically what we say is farm the best and conserve the rest. My Dr. Michael Swanson is an ag economist from, I believe, the University of Minnesota. He's found that on average, across the U.S., 60% of an operation's acres turn a profit, 20% of the acres break even, and 20% are losing money. So, on those 20% of acres that are losing money, it might be best to consider something like the CRP program, the Conservation Reserve Program, to avoid that. This is, again, I believe, a slide related to pheasants, but I think you could extrapolate it a little bit again to prairie grouse and other grassland dependent species. You have the undisturbed grasslands, CRP, here on the picture on the left side. That's a highly preferred cover type, and it's a program we can use to restore habitat at a landscape level. And you can see in the mid 90s, when the CRP program was at its peak, we were harvesting something like 600,000 birds a year, and now we can see 100, with CRP kind of declining, we're down to approximately 136,000 birds. We see that with large declines in general CRP going down, which are kind of general CRP. If you're not familiar, is kind of like larger blocks of habitat. So habitat that the chickens would be using, chickens and sharptails there. Again, the large blocks of habitat. We see an increase here in continuous CRP. Now, continuous CRP is it's kind of resource dependent. So it's things that would buffer streams or buffer fields or pollinator patches, those type of things. And those are increasing, but not quite enough to offset that decline in the general CRP. Here's the CRP in Nebraska by the numbers. You can see we have a total CRP of 1.5 million acres. Nationwide, it's right at 22 million acres. It's down from its high point in the 90s. We still have quite a bit of CRP, but you can see here in 2022, we have 80,000 acres set to expire, and 2023, 50,000, and so on and so forth. So we've got quite a bit of work to do to get these acres re-enrolled and the program reinvigorated here. What can CRP do? Soil erosion, right? So this field, when it was in production agriculture, you can see some sheet and reel erosion happening. CRP can come in and stabilize the soil and solve or address that issue. It can shore up some of these odd areas here. It can square up that fields like this and make it a little easier and more productive to farm. This slide and the next slide are both going to show the first approximately, I believe, 20 rows, coming out from these field edges. Again, increase farm income by reducing input costs on less productive acres. So if you see here the first 20 rows, you're not making real great yield on these, particularly at least out to at least the 18th or 19th row here. So putting that into a CRP edge program might be the way to go to increase profits and have a little bit of habitat on your farm for wildlife and beneficial insects and all sorts of things. So what is available now? Well, unfortunately, that general CRP program just ended here, I believe, in the March 11th, I think, the middle of March. But the current, the continuous CRP is sign up is ongoing until October, or since October 1st. It's ongoing at the moment. I don't believe we have a deadline for it. It's ongoing. Migratory Bird Safe began on December 13th, and it does run for a couple of more days here into April 1st. That Migratory Bird Safe is a program for wetland enhancement, wetland restoration, primarily in the rainwater basin area here in Nebraska. And then the grassland CRPs are for pastured areas. That opens on April 4th and will run through May 13th. And here's a slide that shows those the areas in green are the areas that are open for the Migratory Bird Safe state acres for wildlife enhancement sign up. You see the rainwater basin here, and then some other areas that have high playa density. How else can we help? Well, other than the CRP program, there's the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. The EQIP program, again, is a voluntary conservation program that offers producers financial cost share and technical assistance to implement conservation practices on working agricultural land. What that means is it's typically, EQIP program can be used for anything from tile and terrace to livestock watering, watering structures, those type of practices, to hoop houses or those type of things. But across the country, 10% of these acres must be, 10% of these projects must be used for wildlife friendly practices. Things like we've been talking about all evening, brush cutting, planting of native habitats, those type of projects. And here in Nebraska, that 10% wildlife friendly practices are implemented through a project called EQIP WIN, which is EQIP Wildlife Initiative Nebraska. And again, brush clearing, prescribed fire, wildlife friendly grazing, planting of nesting and brood rearing habitat, wintering cover, all those things would be great EQIP WIN projects. And then what EQIP WIN does in addition, it's different from CRP, is instead of kind of providing an annual payment like CRP does, the EQIP program essentially provides a cost share amount to establish these, or to establish these practices. So it's generally around 50%. Not exactly, not all the time, but that's a good number to shoot for. Nebraska Game and Parks Commission has a number of programs, one of them being Wild Nebraska. This is a umbrella program that primarily delivers wildlife habitat management activities on private lands. They partner with the 23 natural resource districts here in Nebraska, and again provide quality wildlife habitat across the state. Additionally, there's a Burger and Pheasant plan. Right now, I believe it's the Burger and Pheasant Plan 2.0, Nebraska Pheasant Game and Parks Commission plan, aimed at increasing the Nebraska pheasant population and the amount of land open to hunting in areas with abundant pheasant populations. The overall goal is to produce the best experience possible for the most hunters. Part of the ongoing plan involves targeting financial incentives for habitat work benefiting pheasants and within these specific regions. And where you can read pheasants, but you should also, like I said, be thinking quail and prairie chickens and grassland obligate species here. The Open Fields and Water programs. This is a public access for private land program here in Nebraska, seeking to increase hunter and angler participation. This program provides, again, financial incentives for allowing public access and the opportunity for private landowners to work with Game and Parks staff and Game and Parks biologists to improve wildlife habitat. These programs have opened more than 380,000 acres of private land to public access through voluntary enrollment of the landowner. And these annual incentive payments can be, across the state upwards of $15 an acre. And you might say to yourself, well, that's not a ton of money, but you can stack these, this open fields and waters in many cases with some of these other programs that we've talked about earlier. And some of those programs can pay, particularly CRP can pay in the, $200 an acre, upwards of $200 an acre in some areas of the state. Landowners are provided liability protection through the Nebraska Recreation Liability Act. So they'll be held faultless if someone were to trip and fall or twist an ankle or something like that. And these areas are walk-in access only, so you can't drive in or can't take UTVs in or that's not anything like that. So it's not a big disturbance issue. And you might be saying again, well, John, I'm not a hunter. Why do I? Why should all this, these open fields and waters programs and these public access for hunting programs matter to me? Well, the economic impact of pheasant hunting alone the past handful of years has been $23.5 million, as measured by the Fish and Wildlife Service and the U.S. Census Bureau. So the last program I'll talk about is a Nebraska Pheasants Forever specific program. It's funded by some of our partners, Game and Parks, USDA, Nebraska Environmental Trust. And this program, it's called the Pathway for Wildlife program. It's a really flexible program. It's like some of the paperwork. It's a single sheet of paper. You don't need any cropping history like you would with, say, a CRP program. There's an annual payment option. It also provides cost share in the 75 to 100% range, and it's a 1 to 3 year contract. And these kind of stars or exploded areas here, just kind of some examples of what could be done. Again, tree removal, smooth brome control, other cool season grasses, installation of shrubs for escape cover or thermal cover, pollinator habitat for brood rearing and bugging of game birds, and seeding and cover crops. And one great place to do that is in these pivot corners. And if you're not familiar with the pivot corner, picture these kind of triangular areas on the outsides of the irrigation circles. These are small areas that can make large differences, and sometimes they serve as the only habitat in kind of a sea of production ag. And these areas, they might not seem, they're small areas on their own, but when you combine them, if you think of combining, the four corners of somewhere, of some pivot areas there, then we really start getting some serious acreages and some larger areas. And these can be important for habitat improvements and groundwater conservation, of various reasons, to put these pivot corners into habitat. And lastly, I'll mention that we're here to help. The Farm Bill Biologist program with Pheasants Forever is a partnership between the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service and the state wildlife agencies across the country. Here in Nebraska, it's Nebraska Game and Parks. I believe there are approximately over 300 now, I think. Farm Bill biologists across the country, excuse me. And here in Nebraska, we have a biologist not necessarily in every county, but a biologist that covers every county. And there's a map here of our coverage areas to the right. I believe there are over 20 of us now, and over 35 staff with Pheasants Forever here in Nebraska. And if you would like, here's the contact info for the biologists around the state. If you can't read the slide or if you have trouble, just contact me and I'd be happy to put you in contact with your local biologist. With that, thank Olivia and thank Conservation Nebraska for having me, and I suppose we'll move into the question and answer period.
Yeah, thank you, John, and thank you, Mel. That was very informative. It's a lot more there than I thought we were going to have, which is good. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A or the chat function while we have these guys here for a couple more minutes. I am going to launch our exit survey to see if anybody learned anything tonight. We always like to see if people learn things, right? Yeah, it doesn't look like so far anyone has any questions, but we will stay on for another 5-ish minutes, give or take. So if anyone does have any questions, please, again, feel free to drop them in the Q&A or the chat. If for some reason people could not be here tonight, we will have a recording made available, and we will also have a follow-up email with all of the resources that we talked about tonight. Someone asked, what can NGOs that don't own land do to help prairie chickens or Sharpies?
Well, I would think, if you don't have the habitat, you don't have the ground to do habitat work on, just education and outreach, get just kind of keep getting the message out about the need for habitat, the need for the need for grassland bird habitat and prairie chicken habitat, and kind of keep pushing the message.
Could 2 small pastures be made into something with a pathway for wildlife program?
Most likely, yes. Yeah.
What is the status of the North American Grasslands Act?
Yeah, that's a good question. I believe it's still either gathering the votes or on the floor is the last I had kind of heard of that.
What do you consider wildlife friendly grazing?
I could take a stab at that one. I'd say grazing that creates diversity in your grasslands, not doing the same thing year after year after year. Grazing at different times. And again, creating that different structure that I talked about earlier. So if you've got some short cover, some that's been left to allow those plants to become tall, that carries over into the next season. And then some that's kind of in the middle where, as a friend of mine once said, punch some holes in the canopy. So if you've got a pasture that was left idle most of the growing season, you might go in and do a light graze in there and open up some small areas within that. So you have a mix of tall cover and short areas within that. And then grazing that creates the diversity in the grassland too. You want to have a good variety of different species of grass, cool season grasses, warm season grasses. Monocultures of almost any grass are not particularly good habitat. You could plant native big blue stem, but if it's a solid stand of blue stem, it's not that great of cover. So interseeding some of the forbs, the flowering plants in there, or grazing in a way that you promote the native forbs provides good habitat.
John, it looks like someone asked if you could show your contact info slide again. I can share that we will send a follow-up email and we will have his information and the resources in it as well. So if we didn't get it tonight, you can we'll definitely.
Happy to put it back up if you'd like.
Yeah, go for it.
Let's see. Let's go to screen 2. Are we seeing anything?
Yep, we can see it.
There we go.
Perfect. So we got that out there. Doesn't look like there's any more questions. Typing can take a minute. Does for me sometimes. Well, if nobody has any more questions, I want to thank John and Melvin again for giving us your time. Oh, thank you from Iowa. We had someone from Iowa here. That's great. But thank you, John. Thank you, Melvin, for sharing this information and giving us your time tonight. We very much appreciate it, and I think we all learned something. Thank you to everyone who attended. Again, you will get a follow-up email with contact information and resources available to you. Thank you, everyone. Hope everyone has a good night.